Hi everyone, welcome back. In the previous video, we discussed about partnership and also about limited liability partnership, where we saw how two or more persons come together to run a business based on mutual trust and agreement. But imagine this situation. Let's say there are three friends who start a partnership firm. Their business grows rapidly and soon they start dealing with crores of rupees, hiring hundreds of employees, and raising funds from the investors. Now, at this stage, a question arises. Is a partnership structure sufficient for large scale businesses? And what happens if the business suffers heavy losses? Because if you remember, I had explained in partnership that partners have unlimited liability, which means their personal assets can also be used to repay the business debts and liabilities. Now imagine companies like Tata's, Infosys, Reliance, or Wipro operating under such circumstances or under such system. It would have been very risky for them, right? Now, to overcome these limitations, the concept of company evolved. And this is why understanding about the Companies Act becomes very important. So, today we begin week 7, where we will be understanding about what exactly is a company, what are its defining characteristics, why is it considered a separate legal person, and also when can the courts ignore this separate identity. Okay, so let us now begin with the most fundamental concept, that is definition of a company. As per the Companies Act 2013, a company means a company incorporated under the Companies Act 2013 or under any previous company law. So, if I have to teach you in simple words, a company is a legal entity formed by registering under the Companies Act. So, unlike partnerships or even sole proprietorships, a company comes into existence only after registration. So, this clearly means that a company is not created just by agreement, but it is created by law. Okay, so once registered, the company receives a certificate called as Certificate of Incorporation, which actually acts like a birth certificate to the company. Okay, now for example, let's take Reliance Industries Limited. It was not simply created because Dhirubhai Ambani decided to run a business. It legally exists because it was incorporated under the company law and it was registered with ROC. What is ROC? ROC stands for Registrar of Companies. Okay. Now, this legal registration gives the company a separate identity in the eyes of law. Now, after understanding the definition, let's understand some of the unique features that distinguishes company from other forms of business organizations. So, let's now understand the features and characteristics of a company. So, firstly, the most distinguishing feature of a company is that a company has a separate legal entity. What does that mean? This means the company is distinct from its owners, who are nothing but the shareholders. So, therefore, a company can own a property, can enter into contracts, it can sue others, and it can also be sued by others in its own name. And that is why we say a company has a separate legal entity. That means it has an identity which is different from that of its owners. Okay. Now, for example, consider Infosys Limited. Now, the shareholders may change frequently because shares are traded on the stock market, correct? Now, however, Infosys will continue to exist as the same company irrespective of who the shareholders are. Now, this shows that the company has an identity which is separate from that of its owners, and also Infosys can have its own property, it can enter into contracts, it can be sued and it can sue others, and this is what is known as separate legal entity. Okay, now the next important feature is that the company is an artificial person. What do you mean by artificial person? It is called an artificial person because the company is created by law and not by nature. So, unlike human beings, a company cannot think, eat, and sleep, but it can perform legal actions through human agents such as directors and managers. Let's say Apple signs a supply contract with a manufacturer. Now, Apple itself cannot sign the document because it is an artificial person and it is not in existence naturally. Therefore, it only acts through its directors or managers. Okay, so therefore, these authorized directors sign on behalf of the company. Thus, company always functions through the representatives. Okay, now the next important feature of a company is that it has perpetual succession. So what does perpetual succession means? It means the company continues to exist even if its members change. So the shareholders may die, may sell their shares, or even leave the company, but the company continues forever unless it is dissolved legally. Okay, for example, Tata Group of Companies. Who created it? It was created by the legendary JRD Tata. JRD Tata is no more with us, but however, Tata is still continuing to exist and grow. Now, this shows that the company has continuous existence independent of the composition of its members. Okay, now the next important feature of a company is that it has limited liability. Now, one of the biggest advantages of a company is the limited liability. This means that shareholders are not liable and they are liable only to the extent of the unpaid share capital. Their personal assets are always protected. Okay, so let me explain this with an example. Suppose a shareholder invests rupees 10,000 in the shares of a company. Okay. Now, if the company suffers huge losses and becomes bankrupt, the shareholder will only lose 10,000 rupees which he had invested. Okay. So, the creditors cannot claim the shareholder's personal house, car, or even his savings. Okay. Now, this feature encourages large scale investment in the companies. Okay, then the next important feature of a company is with regard to transferability of shares. So in most of the companies, shares can be freely transferred. This means the shareholders can sell their shares to others. Now this makes companies highly liquid investment vehicles. Okay, for example, let's say shares of companies like HDFC Bank, Infosys, Reliance are all traded daily on stock exchanges. Investors buy and sell shares easily without affecting the company's existence. Okay, so the next feature is with regard to common seal. Traditionally, companies used a common seal as their official signature. Okay. Now, since a company is an artificial person, it cannot physically sign the documents. So, therefore, there was a common seal which represented the company's approval. But however, under the Companies Amendment Act 2015, the use of common seals has become optional. Okay. And now the companies can authorize the directors who are appointed to sign the documents. Clear? Now, next important feature is with regard to separate property. Now, the property of the company belongs to the company itself and not to its shareholders just because they are the owners of the company. Okay. Now, suppose you buy shares of Tesla, even if you own shares worth rupees 1 lakh, you cannot claim ownership of Tesla's factories or even their cars. Okay. So, those assets belong to Tesla as a company, not to individual shareholders. Okay. Then, this is with regard to the features of the companies. Now, let's understand a very, very important concept called as corporate will. Okay, doctrine of corporate will. Now, this is a very interesting and also very important topic for all of you to understand. So, please listen carefully. So, I already told you that a company is treated as a separate legal person. In reality, it operates through human beings. Okay? Now, this creates a very important question. Can individuals misuse the company structure in order to escape legal responsibility? Let me put this across in this way. What if someone creates a company only to commit fraud or maybe just to avoid taxes? Now, in such situations, the court may decide to ignore the separate identity of the company. Now, this concept is known as the doctrine of lifting the corporate veil. Okay? Now, what does this mean? The term corporate veil refers to the legal separation between company and its members. Now, normally this veil is protecting the shareholders from personal liability. But when the company structure is misused, courts may lift or pierce the veil and look at the real persons behind the company. Okay? Now, to explain this concept, I have to definitely mention one of the most famous cases in company law, that is Salomon versus Salomon and Company Limited. Okay? Now, this is a very important, or rather, I can say it's a landmark case study, which is always used to explain this concept of lifting the corporate veil. Okay. Now, let me tell you the facts of this case. So, Mr. Salomon started a boot manufacturing business. Okay. Later, he converted the business into a company named Salomon and Co. Limited. Now, he held the majority of the shares while the remaining shares were distributed among his own family members. Now, when the company later became insolvent and was unable to pay the debts and liabilities, the creditors of that company argued that the company was just an agent of Salomon and therefore Salomon should be personally liable. But however, the court held that the company is a separate legal person independent of its shareholders. So therefore, Mr. Salomon was not personally liable for the company's debts. Now this case firmly established the principle of separate legal entity, which means the company is distinct from that of its owners. Okay. Now, let's understand some of the real life examples of lifting the corporate veil, that is, when the companies are using this concept In order to commit fraud, tax evasion, or illegal activities, the separate identity which is given to the company will now be lifted. Okay, and that is what is known as lifting the corporate veil. So, normally the company enjoys protection of separate legal entity, which means the shareholders and the directors are not personally liable for any of the company's action. But however, when it is misused, the courts may have to lift the corporate veil in order to identify the real person behind it. Now, this concept, like I told, is called as lifting the corporate veil, or it is also called as piercing the corporate veil. Let us now understand some of the major situations where the court will lift the corporate veil. Okay, so firstly, something which is very common, okay, that is the court will lift the corporate veil when a company is formed just in order to commit some fraud or to perform some illegal activities. Now, if individuals create a company only as a cover to cheat others, the law will not allow them to hide behind the company. Okay, so imagine a person starts a company that collects money from investors by promising huge returns. Now, after collecting crores of rupees, the company suddenly shuts down. Now, later, it is discovered that the company never had any real business activity and was only created to collect money. Now, in such a situation, the court will lift the corporate veil and hold the directors personally responsible for such frauds. Okay? Now, we'll go to the next situation. Sometimes the companies are created only to avoid paying taxes to the government. Now, if the court finds that a company is merely a device to evade taxes, then they may lift the corporate veil. Suppose a wealthy individual owns several properties and earns huge rental income. Now, in order to reduce the tax liability, the person may create multiple companies and transfer each property into a different company. Now, if the court finds that these companies exist only on paper and are controlled entirely by the same individual, the veil may be lifted. The law will then treat the income as belonging to the individual rather than the companies. Okay? Now let's understand another situation. Sometimes a company may act only as an agent or representative of its shareholders. Now, in such cases, the company is not truly independent. Now, if the company is merely carrying out instructions of its owners, courts may lift the corporate veil. For example, imagine a businessman creates a company but uses it only to sign contracts on his behalf. Now, the company does not make any independent decisions. Everything is controlled by the owner personally. If a dispute arises, the court may say that the company is simply an agent of the owner and therefore the owner will be personally liable. Okay? Now let's understand another situation where the corporate veil may be lifted. So sometimes people create a company to escape an existing legal duty. So, if the court finds that the company was formed specifically to avoid a legal obligation, the corporate veil may be lifted. Okay? And also, sometimes lifting the corporate veil is necessary to protect public interest or for the national interest. The courts may investigate who actually controls the company to ensure that the company's activities are not harmful to the public. So, for example, suppose a company operating in a sensitive sector such as defense manufacturing claims to be an Indian company. However, later it is discovered that the company is actually controlled by foreign individuals who are hiding behind the Indian shareholders. Now, in such cases, the court or the government authorities may lift the corporate veil to identify the true controlling persons. Okay? Then, also sometimes what happens is during the times of war or international conflict, the courts may examine who actually controls a company. Now, even if a company is registered in one country, if it is controlled by enemy nationals, it may be treated as an enemy company. For example, suppose a company is registered in India, but most of its controlling shareholders are from a country that is at war with India. Now, in such cases, the court may lift the corporate veil to determine the true nationality of the company. Now, let me summarize this entire concept in very simple words. Okay. So, think of corporate veil like a mask. So, normally the company wears this mask to protect its members. But, however, if the company is using this mask to hide any fraud or for tax evasion and to conduct any illegal activity, the court will simply remove the mask and ask who is the real person behind this company. Okay? And like I've already explained, corporate veil is removed in situations such as fraud, tax evasion, company acting as an agent of shareholders, avoidance of legal obligations, protection of public interest, and for determining the enemy character. Okay? So, with this, we have understood what a company is and how the law treats it as a separate legal person. Now, the next important question is, are all companies the same or are there different types of companies? So, in the next session, we will explore the various classification of companies under the Companies Act 2013. So, until then, thank you. See you in the next session.